All right, this is going to be a cool lesson today. We're going to learn a lot about basics of how to work with layers inside of Photoshop. As you can see, we're going to make this cool postcard, but we're going to make some tweaks to it. We're going to kind of try to make it our own. So hang tight and follow these steps, and you will learn how to create all of this in one Photoshop document and a lot of other cool, helpful tips along the way. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is download the assets for lesson number 4. If we open this up, we'll see that there's a few images in here, and we're going to use all of these in this project, but we're going to start with the document labeled Start. So let's go ahead and double click on that. That's going to open it up inside of Photoshop. Now, as you can see here, we've already got some layers in play. And so if we come over here, we can see that we've got thumbnails that represent each one of these layers. And as we click the eyeball, we can see as they all turn on and off. Now, one thing I want to point out is that if you ever want to enlarge any of these thumbnails, you can control click the thumbnail on a Mac or command click it on a PC and go to thumbnail size. We have small thumbnails, and again, we could go to large thumbnails. And notice you can also right click once you've enabled that. So if you're like me and you're only going to be working with a few layers and you want to have large thumbnails, then that is going to be a great way to make that a little easier to see and a little easier to realize what layer you're working on. Because after all, it is super important to make sure that you select the layer you want to work on before you get to work. Okay, so now that we have this open, let's go ahead and save this with a new title. It's always a good idea after you get your layers in place here to come over and choose File, Save As, because the Start title doesn't really accurately describe what we're working on. And so if we give this a second here, we'll go ahead and save it as a working PSD. And at the end, if we want to call it Hawaiian Vacation Postcard, we can call it that. So again, we'll just change this title to Working PSD. And again, I'll just type in working, and the .psd is automatically there. Now I'm going to save it back into the same folder that I have my assets in, and we'll click Save. Now it is worth mentioning that for any reason you're not seeing the Layers tab, you can always go over to the Windows drop-down and choose Layers. So we'll go ahead and turn that back on, and there you go. Now we have our layers. Now you'll notice before we get going here that our background layer is locked, and that's going to prevent us from accidentally changing it or making changes to it. Now we can unlock that by simply double clicking on it. It is worth mentioning that you can still paint on a locked layer. Alright, so for the first thing we're going to do, we want to add a photo to this project. And so to do that, we're going to go over to File, Open, and then we're going to navigate to the beach photo in our Lesson 4 assets. And there we go. And click Open. Now you'll notice that this opens it in its own dock, meaning that we've got this one over here with all of our layers in it, and we have a new one over here. And we can toggle between them by just using these tabs up here. And we also have the option to close them using this X right here. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is copy our beach photo into our working PSD. And so one way we can do that is by going to Window, Arrange, to up vertically. And what that does is it allows us to see both of our documents at the same time. And once I've done this, I can simply click. Now again, make sure that you're on the Selection tool. Currently I'm on the Pen tool. So I can hit the V key, and that gets me back to the Selection tool. And now I'm simply going to click on this and drag it over into this document. And there we go. Now we have that image added to our document, and we can adjust it there. And from this point, we can go ahead and close the beach PSD. But it is worth mentioning, for me, that's a little bit of a hassle. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one I dragged over. Okay, so I'm going to show you another way to do this. I'm going to go up to Window, choose Arrange, and I'm going to consolidate all tabs. So now I'm back to where we were. Now the way that I prefer to copy images from one dock to another, while we can drag them fairly easily if we open up two windows, but to me that seems like a bit of a time suck, And so what I prefer to do is hit Command A, which is select all. That's going to be Control A on a PC. Command C to copy, and then just simply go over here to this document and hit Command V to paste. Again, working with key commands seems a lot faster than having to go up and switch your window just to simply copy an image from one PSD to another. So that's a quick tip to make that process a little bit faster. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and close the beach file because I don't need that open in its own window anymore. And I'm going to go ahead and drag the beach layer down to the bottom. Now we'll go ahead and turn off the eye icon on the pineapple. Next thing we're going to do is add a outline around the beach image to make it look like it's an old photo. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the background layer because if you notice, you can see this onion skin or this gray and white checkerboard around the beach photo, and you'll notice that we don't see that over here, and that is because our background layer is solid white. And so if I click the eyeball for the background layer and turn it off, now you can see that this is all opacity, and it was allowing what was underneath it to show through. That's how layers work. We see whatever's on the top. So if we have a solid white layer on the bottom and we lay a photo on top of it, this is what we will see. The solid white poking through in the areas where the photo doesn't cover. But for now, let's go ahead and turn off the white background. And we're going to add a layer style. So we're going to go up to the top and we're going to choose Layer, Layer Style, Stroke. And with the stroke option, that's going to open up this window right here. And this is where we'll have the controls to put a specific pixel size stroke around our image. So in this case, we'll set the stroke to 5 pixels. We'll set the position to inside. We'll leave the blending mode on normal, and we'll leave the opacity at 100%. Now what we want to do now is change the color from black to white. So let's go ahead and just double click on in the color picker, and then we'll come over here and choose white. Now we're not quite at 100% white, and if that's an issue and it matters to you, you can always come down here and type in 7 Fs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you'll notice how that gives us what we call 100% white. And we'll click OK and OK one more time. And now we have a stroke around the edge of our photo. All right, let's go ahead and turn on the eyeballs for the rest of our images. And again, remember this little eyeball icon toggles visibility. Now the first thing we'll notice is that our pineapple is almost completely blocking out the image beneath it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to grab the beach layer, we're going to click on it, and we're going to drag it above the pineapple layer. And now we see that the beach layer is now visible. Okay, and noticing our postage stamp up here, it's pretty dark, and we could probably lower the opacity on that layer to make it a little more see-through. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to select the layer titled Postage, and we're going to come right up here to the top of the layers panel where we see the word opacity. Let's go ahead and click the drop down and drag it down to about 25%. There we go. At this point, it's not a bad idea to save our work. Now you can go ahead and choose File, Save, but I prefer to use the key command, Command S. Again, that's going to be Control S if you're on a PC. So I'll hit Command S, that'll take just a second and save my work, and that way if my computer crashes or shuts down, my work is not going to be lost. All right, now we're going to talk about blend modes just for a second here, and if you notice also on top of the layer stack, you see a drop down that's titled Normal. This is where we're going to find our blend modes. If I hit this drop down, you will see a bunch of different blend modes, and we'll go through these throughout the course of the class. But for today, we'll show you how we can use a couple of these on this postcard. So first thing we'll do is we'll hide the Hawaii text and the flower. And we're going to go ahead and duplicate our pineapple layer. And to duplicate it, you can right click and choose the option Duplicate Layer, which will do just that. Give you the option, if I click that, it chooses Pineapple Copy as the title, and click OK, and you'll notice it puts it right above the pineapple. I'm going to go ahead and drag the copy to the trash just so I can show you another way to do that. If you select the pineapple layer, rather than right-clicking and and having to worry with a menu, you can just hit Command J on a Mac and Control J on a PC, and that will automatically duplicate that layer and basically do the same thing. It saves us the hassle of having to close out that little window that automatically opens, and it just does the same process, but faster with less mouse strokes. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the beach layer's eyeball for just a second. And we're basically going to try to make this pineapple look a little more intense. And blend modes are a great way to do that. In this case, we're not actually blending two different layers together. We're blending a layer with itself. And what that's going to do, if we choose a blend mode like overlay, you'll notice that it's essentially going to punch up the contrast of the image, right? The whites get a little whiter, the darks get a little darker. There it is with no blend mode. It's a little flat, a little low contrast. But if I come down to overlay, now I'm using the overlay blend mode to blend the image with itself. So you can see that what the overlay blend mode does is it takes all the dark pixels and makes them darker, takes the light pixels and makes them lighter, and essentially it's adding contrast to your image. Now, if you feel like this is too punchy, the option right below it, soft light, gives you, a similar look, but not quite as dramatic. You can see if I just hover between these two, you can see soft light looks a little more natural, whereas hard light has got some heavy contrast on it. And while you're here, feel free to drag this down and see what the other ones do as well. Obviously, you get down to something like hard mix, and you realize this might not be appropriate for some situations. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it on overlay because I like the contrasty look for this project. All right, and now we're going to select the postage layer, which is currently turned on, although it's hard to see because we've dropped the opacity down to 25%. Now, for this layer, we'll select it, and we're going to go up and choose the multiply option. What multiply does is it tends to punch up things a little bit. It adds a little more darkness to their pixels. With blending modes, each blending mode uses different math to combine a layer with the layer beneath it. Overlay tends to increase contrast, whereas multiply tends to darken its layer. At this point, let's go ahead and hit Command S to save our work. Okay, at this point, we're going to go ahead and turn our beach photo back on, and we're going to resize and rotate it slightly. And so you can see we have this image here, and what we want to do is we want to be able to move it around the frame and resize it and rotate it. So we're going to select the layer, and we're going to hit Command T. That enables the free transform option, and you'll notice that if we look up here at the top, we will see some information regarding that. So what it does is it puts control points at the corners and at the middle of this layer. Now with those control points, if I just simply click and drag, I can resize the image. And as you can see up top, as I do that, it is actually updating the width and the height of the image. And now if I move it vertically, you'll see the Y value changing. And so I'm going to drag this up kind of over here underneath the stamp. I'm going to shrink it down to about this size. And now notice if you put your mouse just to the outside of one of these control points, you can click and rotate the image. And that's what we're going to do right here. And there we go. Now once you're done with this, you can hit the check mark to OK it, or you can hit the return key. So once we're done with the free transform tool, we can just click the check mark up here to OK the transform. And there we go. All right, and now let's go ahead and turn on our flower layer. And we're going to go ahead and try to just reposition our beach photo a little bit by selecting that layer, making sure we have the move tool selected, which again is the V key. And I'm going to kind of drag this down to just kind of get the corner of the image tucked under that flower. All right, so now we're going to go down to our background layer. We're going to turn on the eyeball, and we're going to select that layer and choose the new layer option. Now the new layer option is right down here at the bottom, right next to the garbage can. It's a little plus sign with a square around it. And that gives us a new layer between the pineapple and the background layer. Now we're going to go ahead and select the title of this layer. Right now it's currently layer 2. But if you click on the word layer 2 and double click, we're going to type in clouds, because that's what we're going to create here. All right, now we're going to change some colors around. So we'll come over here to our color picker over on the far left. We'll double click on the foreground color, which is the one on top. And we're going to pick some colors to create our clouds with. And the way we're going to plug in these colors is by numerically changing the RGB value. So let's come over to the R value and let's change that to 48. We'll then come over to the green value and change that to 138. And then finally the blue value will be 174. And that should give us a nice sort of teal bluish color. Okay, so by picking that color, we're going to let Photoshop automatically generate some clouds in the background. But first, we need to make sure that we change this background color from black to white. So, to toggle between the foreground and background color, you can simply press X on your keyboard. Or you can use this little arrow right here, which also does the same thing. Again, keyboard command's a better way to go. And on top of that, we're going to go ahead and just click on the black color and drag this up into the white corner and click OK. And then we're going to switch them back. Okay, so it's important that we have this blue in the foreground and white in the background. And now that we've done that, we're going to select our clouds layer. We're going to go up to Filter, Render, Clouds. And watch what happens. It automatically creates a really cool cloud layer. Let's go ahead and just turn off the top layers. I'm just going to drag my mouse up the edge there. And we get these nice automated clouds. Very cool, very easy. So we'll turn these layers back on and continue with our project here. At this point, it's not a bad idea to hit Command S and save your work. Okay, at this point, we're going to go ahead and add an additional image to this project. And since I wanted to add it above the flowers layer, I'm going to go ahead and click the flowers layer. All right, so I'm going to drag Photoshop over to the side here. And notice that we have an image called Flower 2. So I'm going to click on this image and I'm simply going to drag it into my image over here. And now we see that my Photoshop dock has a new layer added to it. It's a purple flower. It put it right above the other flower. That's why we selected that flower first. Of course, we could always move it in the stack later. All right, so now we're going to grab this layer and we're going to drag it over to the lower left-hand corner so about half the flower is visible. Now that we've got our images laid out, let's go ahead and start adding some text. If your Hawaii layer is not visible, go ahead and turn it on. And now we want to go ahead and deselect all of our layers so that nothing is selected. And we can do that by just clicking in this gray area over here. And now we're going to come over and choose the type tool. It's actually the horizontal type tool. And we'll click that and make sure that we're using the top version there. Now before we start typing, we're going to get our typeface to look the way we want it. And to do that, we're going to go up to Window, and we're going to open up the Character window. The Character window is the window that allows us to choose all sorts of basic font information, things like size, things like the font, the weight, kerning, leading, all of these little options like superscript and all caps. So let's go ahead and use these right now to get our text looking the way we want it to look. So let's go ahead and select a condensed font. And so in this case, you'll notice that the book recommends Birch Standard, which isn't currently available. It is worth mentioning that you can add fonts directly from Adobe right here. For example, if I type in Birch and that font isn't available, I can go over to More About Adobe Fonts. I can click on this icon and I can actually add that font to my list of existing fonts. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just choose Arial. We'll go with something like Arial Regular, knowing that it's always easy to go back and change that later. And we'll use something like a 36-point font. And let's come down here and just go ahead and click on our screen. And notice that it's going to give us some dummy text to work with right away. And this makes it easier sometimes to decide what you want to do with your font. I'm going to stretch out the tracking a little bit by just literally clicking on this VA icon and just dragging it. You'll notice how if you don't have a number specific that you want to type in, you can just click on the button next to it and, like I said, just drag it out and see what it does. I'm also going to go ahead and set this to faux bold, which notice fattens up the letters a little bit. And we'll pick a color like, oh, I don't know, something like a grassy looking green. We'll go right about there. And we'll click OK. All right, now one more thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to all caps, which is this 2 T's right here. And now that I've done that, I can go back and reduce the tracking just a little bit. All right, now that we have got our text looking the way we want, let's go ahead and change what is here. And notice that right now everything is selected. You can tell because we have this selection outline around our text. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the words Island Paradise. And since I chose all caps, I don't have to worry about even holding down the caps lock button or the shift button. And there we go. Now let's go ahead and close, let's go ahead and shrink our font down just a little bit. And I want to be real clear about something. In order to change text, you have to have it selected. My cursor is still live, which would allow me to delete or add words, but unfortunately the text itself is not selected. And I can reselect it by clicking and dragging over it with the cursor. But I'll be honest, that opens you up to a lot of potential for mistakes. So I'm going to go ahead and just undo that. And instead what I'm going to do to select it is just come over to the text layer and double click on the T icon. And you'll notice by doing that, it automatically selects everything. And now I can go back and I'm going to click on the T's next to the word or next to the font size option. And we'll shrink those back down a little bit. And at that point, I think I'm looking okay. I might bump it up to 30. And then I'm going to nudge this to the left, but I'm going to do that using the arrow keys after I'm done typing. Okay, so once I'm done changing the text, I can then go back and switch to the Move tool, and that will allow me to use the arrows to nudge that text over a little bit and try to center it just a little bit better than what I had. All right, so we're going to add a gradient to the word Hawaii. So let's come over and control click the thumbnail, and that gives us the option to select pixels. And now that those pixels are selected, we're going to go over and select the gradient tool. Now the gradient tool is right here. It looks like a square with a little gradient on it. And you'll notice there's even instructions on how to use it right there in the thumbnail. So if I click, now I have the gradient tool selected. And we're going to go ahead and change the foreground color in our color picker. So let's go ahead and double click on that. And let's set it to a bright shade of orange. So we'll come over here to orange, maybe try to get something a little brighter. There we go. That looks good. Now, since our foreground color is orange and our background color is white, that means our gradient is going to go in between the two. One end will be white, one end will be orange. Now with the gradient tool, there's a couple different gradients to choose from, and we want to make sure that we are using the right one. And so in order to do that, if we look up here, you'll see there's 5 options. If I hold my mouse over the first one, it says linear gradient, and that's the one we want to use. There's also a radial gradient and an angle gradient and a reflected gradient, as well as a diamond gradient. But for now, linear gradient is what we want. And at this point, we're just going to click just below the W in the word Hawaii and drag our mouse upwards. And you'll notice that with the gradient tool selected, you'll see this line get created, and it's only going to affect the selected pixels. So let's go ahead and let go, and there we go. We get a nice gradient in our text with just one click. And if you don't like the gradient, or maybe you want it to be a little more white and a little less orange, you can always hit Command Z and just come down a little bit lower and click and drag up to the top. Now, if you want to make sure you're dragging up in a straight line, you could hold down Shift, and that'll constrain your mouse. And so you notice that starting a little bit lower kind of drops the dark orange down a little bit out of sight and gives us a little bit more of the white at the top. All right, we're going to go ahead and dress this up with a couple layer styles here. So let's go ahead and hit Command D to deselect the Hawaii text. And we're going to go down to where it says Island Paradise. And let's go ahead and add a drop shadow to that text. Now, if you want to add a drop shadow to your text, all you have to do is come down to this little FX button at the bottom and click on that, and you'll see the option to add a drop shadow. Of course, make sure to select the layer first. And you'll notice that it automatically adds the drop shadow and gives you these controls. Depending on what you're looking for, this might be fine just as it is by default. But if you want a little more distance, you'll notice that you can kind of move that drop shadow. You can also increase its spread to make it larger. And you can increase its size. Now notice that if I go to a certain size, it just becomes a big dark shadow. What you might opt to do is increase the size a little bit, keep the spread nice and low. That gives you a really soft drop shadow that doesn't really show the letters specifically. Or you can bring the size down, and you notice that then we can see the outline of the letters a lot better. So it just depends on the look you're going for. If you want it soft, increase the size but lower the spread. If you want it nice and sharp, keep the size down, and you might even opt to keep the distance a little bit closer as well. Now in this case, I think the opacity is a little low, so I'm going to raise that up to about 75%. And now I can see it a little bit better. And now when I make these adjustments, it's a little more noticeable. There we go. So I've got mine with a distance of 4, a spread of 10, and a size of 8. Feel free to play around with that until you get something that you like. And once you're done, go ahead and click OK. Now, one thing that's worth noticing is that when you add a layer style, you'll actually see it showing up underneath the text. So here's my text for Island Paradise. We see the word effects. Now, if I have multiple effects, I can turn them all off by clicking the eyeball. But in this case, I only have one. And if I click it off, you'll notice that it toggles on and off the visibility. And what's also worth knowing is that if you want to use this same drop shadow without having to go through and plug in all the numbers, you can right-click and choose Copy Layer Style or Clear Layer Style if you'd rather do that, if you want to get rid of it. But copying layer style will then give me the option to paste it onto other layers. Now, if I wanted to drag that, simply drag it onto another layer, I could hold down Option and click and drag that effect down onto my Hawaii layer. So go ahead and try that. Hold down Option, click on Drop Shadow, and just drag it down to the other layer. Now, if you're on a PC, you're going to need to press Alt and then click on the drop shadow and simply drag it. And that allows me to apply the exact same effect without having to go back and play with any of the settings. Now let's go ahead and add a layer style to the Hawaii text as well. So we'll select the Hawaii text, we'll go down to the FX button, and let's go to stroke. Now in this case, let's add a green stroke around the text. So we have some options here. We can click in the color picker and pick a new color, pick a green, or notice that if I drag the mouse off the color picker, I get an eyedropper. That would allow me to come down and sample the green from the Paradise text. So I'll go ahead and do that and click OK. But I'm going to go ahead and shrink it pretty small. Let's drop it down to about 3 or 4 pixels. Let's go with 3. I want its position to be on the outside. And for blend mode, I'll leave it to normal. For opacity, I'll leave it at 100%. Now let's use a drop shadow on one of the flower layers. So with this top red flower up here, we could add a little bit of a three-dimensional feel by putting just a little drop shadow behind it. So let's grab the flower. Let's go down to the FX button at the bottom of the layer stack, and let's choose drop shadow. In this case, we'll set the opacity to 60%. We'll set the distance to 13. We'll set the spread down to 9. Let's set the size at 16. And we also have one additional option that we are going to click here, and that is to use global light. And notice right here it does say use global light. We're also going to make sure the blend mode is set to multiply, and we'll click OK. Alright, now with the layer style box still open, you'll notice that we have access to all of the other layer styles as well. So with this open, let's go ahead and put a check mark next to the word satin. So if we click on the word satin, First thing we're going to do is change the blend mode from multiply to color. And on top of that, let's drop our opacity down to about 20%. Let's change this color from black to something like a fuchsia, maybe a light purple in this case. And then we'll set the opacity to 22, and we'll set the distance to 22 as well. Now, when I click OK, if this stays dark, which it did, which means that basically that fuchsia effect is not taking place. In order to make sure that it does, I'm going to go back to the effects button here and double click on it. And if I go back to satin, you'll notice that it didn't update the change to the color. I'm on a newer Mac Mini, and one thing that I've noticed with Adobe software is that occasionally it just drops commands. So let's try this one more time. We'll click in here, we'll set this back to pink, and there you go. Now it's working. So again, I can't explain that. I've gone through this a couple times off camera, and it's done the same thing every time. It's just something you got to work with. So I'll set these back down to where I had them at about 22 and 20% opacity, and it gives us just a little bit of a pink punch to that image. And again, let's go check the drop shadow. Now notice that the drop shadow has changed as well. Set that back to black. Click OK. And now everything seems to be working. Not sure why it was updating those changes like that. I think it is something with Adobe and Mac Silicone. So again, I apologize. But if yours doesn't change right away, go back and take a look. And there we go. Now, see, you'll notice that we're seeing the fuchsia, but we're not seeing the drop shadow. Let's go back and apply this one more time. That's because it also changed the blend mode for the drop shadow to color. So we'll set this back to multiply. There you go. Now we have our drop shadow and our fuchsia satin. Hopefully it worked for you guys first try. Again, I'm on a newer Mac, and I've noticed a couple issues with Adobe software. Okay, let's click OK and move on. Okay, now let's go down to our purple flower in the lower left-hand corner, and we'll select it, and we're going to add an adjustment layer to this one. So with our purple flower in the lower left-hand corner, with that selected, we're going to go down to this little circle icon, and we'll click on it, and we are going to add a hue saturation adjustment. And you'll notice that in this case, it's going to put it right above that layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the hue to a value of 43. Now again, I'm going to click on this and drag it, but you could obviously type those numbers in as well. And the first thing you'll notice about adjustment layers is that they affect everything beneath them, right? So you'll notice that our Hawaii text is not being affected, and neither is our postage stamp, but all of the layers underneath are. Now while we're there, let's also crank our saturation up to 19, and we'll leave the lightness at 0. Now there is the option to create what's called a clipping mask. And what a clipping mask does is it tells Adobe Photoshop only to apply this adjustment layer to the layer directly beneath it. And to do that, we're going to press this button right here. It's a little square with a little arrow and a null sign through it. And you'll notice that as soon as I click this, it's going to essentially clip this adjustment layer just to the layer beneath it, which in this case is the purple flower. Let's go ahead and press that button and watch all of our other colors come back to normal. And now that is only affecting this flower. If I turn the eyeball on and off, I can see that it's working. And again, that's a really important one to remember because adjustment layers are so powerful and we use them so often that knowing how to apply it to just one layer versus everything beneath it is a huge thing to remember. So this little button right here, I'm pointing it out twice, is the button that will allow you to apply an adjustment layer to just one layer. Okay, we're just about done. Let's go ahead and add one more effect to the Hawaii text. If we come down to the word Hawaii, we already have a drop shadow on that text. But let's go ahead and choose the FX button and let's add another drop shadow. But for this one, let's pick that same fuchsia color that we had earlier. And to do this, I'm going to go ahead and click here, and then I'm going to drag my mouse down to this flower. And I'm going to select that color from the flower. I'll click OK. And now let's play with the numbers here just a little bit. Let's set our distance up to 20. We'll set our spread to 27. And we'll set our size up to 45. Essentially what we're doing here is we are creating a sort of soft highlight behind our Hawaii text. And it just helps the text pop off the page a little bit more. Let's go ahead and pop the opacity up to 100% so we can see it a little bit better while leaving the blend mode set to multiply. And then we'll click OK. And you'll notice that if we click that on and off, it gives us a nice little highlight behind our text, making it pop off the page just a little bit more. All right, now we're going to make a few adjustments to our postage stamp up here. Let's go over to that layer. Let's select the Move tool. I'm going to scoot my screen over here. And we're going to move this down into the center. Let's go ahead and scale it down a little bit by hitting Command T. And with just the postage selected, I can use the arrow keys now to nudge it up. If I hold down Shift, I can nudge it over. Anytime I can move stuff this way, I kind of prefer to do it. It just keeps things from accidentally getting selected. And once I'm done, I can hit Command D to deselect that postage stamp. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here is put a border around this to make it look like a nice postcard. And so to do that, we need to select the entire image. And to do that, we're going to hit Command A. That selects everything. And then we're going to go to Select, Modify, Border. This modify is a really important thing to remember under the selection option because it allows us to do some really important adjustments to any type of selection that we make, whether we're clipping out a person or adding a border to a postcard. So when I click border, let's go ahead and type in 10 pixels and click OK. Now we don't want to do this on our existing layer, so let's go ahead and add a new layer. Meaning that if I did it right now, it would add it to this text layer, which we don't want. So let's go ahead and with our top layer selected, let's hit the New Layer button, and we can call this layer Border. Now it makes sense to have it on top because that way everything underneath it will get covered up by this little edge border we're going to create. Alright, so now that I have my selection live, my ants are marching. If not, just hit Command A again and go to Border, set it to 10 pixels. And then we can go to Edit, Fill. Now we'll get into some of our options for filling here, but make sure that foreground color is selected because that will fill it with our foreground color from our color picker. And let's click OK. And there we go. We get this nice looking border. We'll hit Command D to deselect the selection. All right, now that we're done, let's go ahead and go File, Export, Export As. And again, this is where we'll save our JPEG version of it. Let's go ahead and change our height to 1000 pixels. And I'm going to set the quality to highest possible. And go ahead and hit Export. Now this one I'll save as my... Alright, so we'll type in the title Final _ postcard. And then I'll put my name and last name on it. And I will save it to my project folder. There we go, right there, lesson 4. Save. And close. And I'll hit Command S to save my work in my PSD. And now that we are done, I will go ahead and close Photoshop. And that'll do it, folks. All right, if you learned something here, go ahead and leave a like. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe. And there'll be plenty more in the future. Thanks for watching.